For centuries, the world has been captivated by the legend of a captive princess. But what's the real story? Well, her real story is way more complex and honestly more powerful than any myth. So let's dive in. A famous poem paints this picture of the legendary Fragrant Concubine, a warrior who defied an emperor. But who was she really? Her story doesn't start with some mythical fragrance. It starts with a different name entirely. Her birth name was Mamure Aziz Henem. She was born back in 1734 to a noble Uyghur family. And she was born into some seriously turbulent times. We're talking internal wars and the threat of invasion. Her upbringing was anything but ordinary. She wasn't just a scholar, she was also trained as a warrior. When her husband rose to power, she took a new name that was fit for a queen, Nur Elanor Henem. After her husband was killed fighting the Qing, she didn't surrender. She rallied 400 soldiers to fight on. Then, in a wild battle, her helmet got knocked off. The enemy commander saw her and ordered her captured alive. When she met the emperor, she flat out refused to kneel. I mean, what an incredible act of defiance. The emperor was totally obsessed. He tried everything to win her over, trying to recreate her home for her. But you know what? She wasn't having any of it. Her loyalty to her people and her faith was absolute. So the emperor's mother got worried about her influence and had her poisoned while the emperor was away. But her death wasn't the end, not by a long shot. In fact, it was the start of new mysteries. So about that Fragrant Concubine name, it probably just came from the perfumes she wore or those trees. The biggest mystery, though, her final resting place. 2 different tombs, hundreds of miles apart, both claim her. One story says her followers carried her body over 3,000 miles, all the way back to her homeland. But then there's this other tomb found in the Qing Imperial Cemetery right near Beijing. Okay, but here's the catch. The evidence from that Beijing tomb just doesn't add up with her life story. Maybe the best way to understand her is through a poem she wrote herself while she was a prisoner. In this poem, you can really feel her inner world. She was ready to die before giving up her honor. It's interesting, over the years, her story has been completely reshaped to fit different political agendas. So in the end, her real tomb, it's in the hearts of the Uyghur people. From warrior queen to defiant captive, her real story is way more powerful than any legend could ever be. Today, we're diving into the story of one of history's most romanticized figures, the Fragrant Concubine. You've probably heard the story, right? It sounds like a perfect fairy tale, a beautiful Uyghur princess with this enchanting natural scent that just completely captivates an emperor. I mean, it's been turned into poems, plays, you name it. Okay, but here's the thing. What if that whole legend is a lie? Because the real story, well, it's this incredibly tangled web of rebellion, defiance, and a fight for identity that's still going on. The fragrant princess part, that's a myth. The woman behind it, though, oh, she was very real and honestly way more formidable. So to get to the truth, we've got to rewind way back, before the palace, before any of the legends, all the way to her birth in 1734. See, she wasn't born to be a concubine. She was born into a noble family that was deep in a generations-long struggle for independence. And just look at this timeline. It completely reframes her entire story, doesn't it? This isn't some passive princess waiting around. By 17, she's marrying a rebel leader. A few years later, she's taking on this political name, Nur Elanor, and she's out there leading troops in battle against the Qing invasion. This is the life of a political and military leader, someone who was right in the thick of her people's fight for their own sovereignty. And listen, she wasn't just some figurehead, you know? Look at this list. She's a poet, fluent in the classical script, but she's also an expert with a horse, a sword, and a bow. She was actually commanding troops on the battlefield. So we're talking about someone who was so much more than a beautiful face. She was a brilliant, highly skilled, and educated leader of her people. All right, so this is where her story takes its most dramatic turn. She's captured in battle and presented like a prize to the Qianlong Emperor in Beijing. But what follows isn't a romance. Nope, it was a 3-year battle of wills, all happening inside the walls of the Forbidden City. I mean, right from her very first moment in the Forbidden City, she made her defiance crystal clear. Can you just picture it? The entire court is bowing to the emperor, but this one woman stays standing, basically challenging the most powerful man in the land right to his face. And this incredible act of courage, it just captivated him. So he then tried everything to win her over. And his campaign to win her over was, well, it was extraordinary. We're not talking about just a few gifts here. He literally built her a piece of her homeland inside Beijing. It had the right architecture, the plans she knew. He even built her a mosque and brought in an entire community for her. And yet she resisted every single move, secretly carrying a dagger with her as a constant sign of her resolve. And we have this one really powerful glimpse into her mindset from a poem that's attributed to her. This is no love poem. This is a political and spiritual last stand. It's a declaration that she was absolutely willing to die for her faith, her homeland, and her principles. 29. That's how old she was when she died in 1765. After 3 years of this incredible resistance, she was gone. Now, historical accounts suggest she was poisoned on the orders of the emperor's own mother, the Empress Dowager. Apparently, she feared the political fallout of having a defiant Muslim woman in the palace and, the possibility of a Muslim heir to the throne. Okay, so this is absolutely crucial. The names we actually know her by, they weren't her own. They were labels given to her by her captors and then by later generations. And each name tells a completely different story. This table really shows how her identity itself became a kind of battleground. Mamure Aziz, that was her, the individual. Nur Elanor was the warrior queen her people looked up to. Then you get Xiang Fei, the Fragrant Concubine. That's the romantic legend the Qing court created, probably to erase the rebel. And then Iparhan, the name she's known by today among Uyghurs, was actually a 20th century move by scholars to reclaim her as their national hero. And you'd think her death would be the end of the mystery, but no, it just created a new one. Now we have 2 different locations, thousands of kilometers apart, and both of them claim to be her final resting place. And this whole debate, it really gets to the heart of who gets to own her story. So here are the 2 competing claims. Over in Kashgar, local tradition says her body was brought all the way back home in this epic journey. That's the story of a hero returning to her people. But then, in Beijing, archaeologists found a tomb they claimed was hers, which paints her as an honored imperial concubine. The thing is, the evidence for both is really debated. The Kashgar claim? It's all based on oral history. And the Beijing tomb? Well, forensic analysis suggests the remains belong to a much older woman who wasn't even Uyghur. So this debate really asks a fundamental question. Who gets to tell her story? So why? Why, after more than 2 centuries, is her story still such a battleground? Well, it's because she's not just some figure from the past. She's become a powerful, living symbol. And really, if there's one thing to take away from all this, it's how a single person's life can become a mirror for centuries of political change. The story of the Fragrant Concubine isn't just about what happened. It's about what different people at different times needed it to mean. And you can see how each era has kind of remade her in its own image. For Uyghurs, she's this powerful icon of unwavering resistance and faith. For the revolutionaries who came after the Qing dynasty, she was a fellow hero who fought against that old imperial system. And for modern China, her story is often spun as a romance, a symbol of ethnic harmony and unity. Every retelling tells you more about the storyteller than it does about her. So in the end, we're not left with one clear picture of a single woman. What we have instead is this powerful, fascinating example of how history itself gets written, erased, and then rewritten over and over again. From warrior queen to fragrant concubine, her identity has been this constant struggle. And that leaves us with one last, really provocative question. When history itself is a battleground, who actually owns the truth?
Imagine a woman whose true identity is so fiercely debated and honestly so politically volatile that today you literally have 2 entirely different locations, thousands of miles apart, claiming to hold her tomb.
Right. It's a massive historical tug-of-war.
Exactly. I mean, imagine a military commander whose original name was completely eradicated by an empire.
Yeah.
And they did this specifically to erase her political past,
Yeah.
Only to have her story completely resurrected, adapted, and then weaponized by, well, everyone.
Oh, yeah. From like 18th century monarchs all the way to 20th century playwrights.
It's wild.
Yeah.
So if you're listening, welcome to another deep dive. Our mission today is to unpack this remarkably rich, multi-layered document we have. It's titled The Captive in the Qing Imperial Palace Iparhan.
And this document, it is essentially the ultimate case study in narrative warfare. We're looking at a historical landscape where the ledger isn't just altered, it's systematically burned and rewritten and painted over to serve the statecraft of whoever happens to be holding the pen at the time.
Which makes it such a fascinating topic. We are tracing the life of a legendary figure who is known to history by 4 completely different names. We're exploring how a single human life can be interpreted and fought over for centuries.
But before we jump into the mechanics of how this legend was built, we really need to establish the nature of the source material we are analyzing today.
Yes, absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up, because it is critical for context. The document we are examining today contains highly politically charged viewpoints.
Highly charged.
Right. It deals intimately with the history of Eastern Turkestan, Uyghur nationalism, colonization, and the imperial actions of the Qing dynasty. So if you're listening right now, we just need to state this explicitly.
We really do.
We are not taking any political sides today. Our job on this deep dive is simply to report what is contained within the source material provided.
Exactly. We are exploring the author's historical accounts and their specific arguments regarding this figure, but we are not endorsing the political viewpoints within the text.
Right. We are just acting as a mirror to the document, so you can understand the depth and the gravity of the historical debate it presents.
So with that framework in mind, to understand the myth that this woman eventually became, we have to strip away, centuries of imperial storytelling.
We have to go back to the reality of a young girl who was born into a staggering amount of political turbulence.
Let's start right at the beginning. The year is 1734. And the very first thing we need to understand, the first big misconception to clear up, is that her name was not Iparhan.
Wait, it wasn't?
No, not at all. The name she was given at birth was Mamure Aziz Khanim.
Okay, Mamure Aziz. And the text says she was born in the Nilka region, right?
Yeah, the text pinpoints it as the area between the Kash River and April Mountain. But honestly, her geography is kind of secondary to her genealogy.
Her lineage is the key to everything.
It really is. Her father is Ali Khoja, her mother is Mastor Aziz. And the crucial detail here is that she is a 4th-generation descendant of a highly influential figure named Muhammad Yusuf Khoja.
Right, and the document mentions that Muhammad Yusuf Khoja was a major leader of the White Mountain, or the Aksu Sufi sect.
He was.
But for those who might not be totally steeped in the geopolitical intricacies of 18th century Central Asia, what does leading a Sufi sect actually mean in this context? Because, it sounds purely religious on the surface.
That does sound that way, yeah.
But the text treats this sect as a massive political force.
And that is a crucial distinction to make.
Yeah.
In this region and in this specific era, religious authority and political power were deeply, deeply intertwined.
So they weren't just like spiritual leaders.
Not at all. These Sufi sects were not just philosophical study groups. They functioned as massive socio-political factions. I mean, they controlled resources, they commanded immense loyalty among the populace, and they had the very real ability to mobilize resistance or legitimize a ruling power.
Wow.
Yeah. The White Mountain sect and their bitter rivals, the Black Mountain sect, were essentially political parties operating under the banner of theological lineage.
Okay, that makes so much more sense. Which brings us to the ghost in her family tree, so to speak. The text provides this deep historical backstory, and it actually takes us back 105 years before Mamure Aziz was even born.
All the way back to the year 1680.
Right. Her ancestor, a man named Apak Khoja, makes a decision that essentially detonates the entire existing political order.
He does. It's a defining moment. Apak Khoja, who is seeking to gain absolute control over the region, decides to ally himself with the Dzungar forces.
And the Dzungars, they were a nomadic confederation, right?
Exactly. Led by a commander named Galdan, they were a powerful, rapidly expanding nomadic empire. So Apak Khoja uses this foreign military backing to overthrow this idea Uyghur Khanate.
And just to put that in perspective for you listening, this idea Khanate wasn't some fleeting administration. They had been ruling for 300 years.
3 centuries.
Yeah, Apak Khoja brings down a 3-century-old dynasty just so he can rule Kashgar himself.
But the catch is, he rules it as a puppet. He is paying tribute to the Dzungars. He literally leverages an external empire to crush his own people's ruling structure.
Which is just a massive betrayal.
It is. And the fallout from this decision is catastrophic. It kicks off decades of brutal, endless sectarian warfare between those White Mountain and Black Mountain factions we talked about.
Just a cycle of retaliation.
Yeah, a cycle that completely destroys the stability of the entire region.
Okay, so let's fast forward to 1713. The text says a Dzungar leader, named Sawang Rabtan attacks Kashgar, and the geopolitical pendulum swings yet again.
Right, because now Mamure Aziz's family, the very descendants of the man who invited the Dzungars in, are forced into exile by those same Dzungars.
Oh, the irony.
It's incredible. They are banished to Nilka, and that is the exact environment Mamure Aziz is born into 21 years later.
He is born into a total paradox.
Yes, perfectly said. Her family holds this immense elite status within their religious faction, yet they possess absolutely zero actual political power, and they're living in forced exile.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. If you are listening to this and putting yourself in her shoes, the psychological weight of that inheritance is just staggering.
It's huge.
I mean, imagine being born into a family where your great-grandfather is widely viewed as the ultimate traitor, the guy who sold out your homeland. You aren't just inheriting exile, you know. You're inheriting the blame for the collapse of your homeland's sovereignty.
Exactly. That is a heavy, heavy burden for a child. And what the author of the document finds so fascinating is how her family chose to raise her under that immense pressure.
Right. They didn't just hide her away.
No, they didn't prepare her for a quiet life of obscurity at all. The source details an incredibly rigorous, elite upbringing. She received a high-class Islamic education, which specifically included mastering the Chagatai script.
Let's pause on the Chagatai script for a moment, because the text highlights it as a specific, really important mark of her education. Why is that detail so significant?
Chagatai was the classical literary language of Central Asia at the time. It was the language of scholars, of high court poetry, of diplomacy.
Oh, okay. So by ensuring she mastered Chagatai, her family was essentially giving her the intellectual tools of the ruling class. They were educating her to participate in the highest levels of political and cultural discourse. She actually became an accomplished poet in her own right. Wow, that's impressive. But the curriculum didn't stop at the library.
Not at all.
The document states that under the strict guidance of her two brothers, Toki Khoja and Turdi Khoja, she was trained in martial arts. She mastered horseback riding, fencing, and archery.
It is such a striking juxtaposition, isn't it? She is studying complex theology and classical literature in the morning, and then heading out to the courtyard to drill with a sword and shoot arrows from the saddle in the afternoon.
It sounds less like a standard aristocratic upbringing and more like they were forging a weapon.
That's a great way to put it.
I mean, they're stranded in exile, carrying this horrific historical baggage, and they are training the next generation not just to survive, but to fight.
They are actively preparing her for a reality where violence and diplomacy are indistinguishable. And that preparation, it gets put to the test very quickly. In 1751, at the age of 17, her life undergoes a massive shift.
She gets married.
She does. And she doesn't marry a merchant or some low-level cleric. She marries her cousin, Khoja Jahan, who the text describes as both a poet and a brilliant military tactician.
So they are incredibly well matched.
They really are. This marriage is the bridge between her education and her destiny. It transitions Mamure Aziz from a highly trained noblewoman in exile into an active, leading participant in a brutal geopolitical war.
And the text notes they had a son together, though tragically his fate is just lost to the historical record.
Yeah, it's a sad historical omission. But this marriage brings us to the birth of her second identity. We move from Mamure Aziz to Nur Elanor.
So how does that happen? What's the catalyst?
The catalyst for this name change happens in 1756. The Dzungar Empire, the same empire that exiled her family, remember, is fracturing. It's falling apart.
Right.
And the Qing dynasty is rapidly expanding westward, capitalizing on this Dzungar collapse. Her husband, Khoja Jahan, gets involved in a rebellion against this expanding Qing presence, but the rebellion fails.
They are completely outmaneuvered and forced to flee the Ili region. The text says they retreat all the way to Kucha.
But they don't surrender. This is the crazy part. In Kucha, Khoja Jahan and his brother make a highly provocative move. They establish a brand new government. They call it the Batur Khan government.
Let's just pause on the mechanics of that for a second. Establishing a quote-unquote government in exile while you are actively fleeing an imperial army.
It's incredibly bold.
It requires a massive amount of logistical and ideological coordination. You are trying to legitimize the state while literally on the run.
And as the wife of the leader of this new Batur Khan regime, she's elevated. She's given a new title, a completely new public identity. She becomes Nur Elanor Khanim, which translates to the beloved queen bathed in light.
That's a powerful title. But the author of the document makes it very clear that Nur Elanor was not just some ceremonial queen.
Right. Oh, absolutely not. She didn't just accept the title and retreat to a tent to sit on a cushion. She put on armor. She actively assisted her husband in planning military strategy, and she trained right alongside the frontline soldiers.
So those childhood lessons in fencing and archery were suddenly the skills keeping her alive.
Exactly. And in 1758, the Baturkan government launches an armed rebellion against Qing rule in Kashgar. This is a massive, coordinated military effort.
And the text says for months, they actually hold their own in fierce combat, which is amazing.
It is, but eventually the sheer scale of the Qing military apparatus just grinds them down. The logistics of empire almost always win out. Nur Elanor, her husband, and his brother are forced into this desperate retreat into the treacherous mountains of Badakhshan.
They are seeking sanctuary, just looking for a moment to rebuild their forces.
Right, but Emperor Qianlong of the Qing dynasty, he does not leave loose ends. He understands that as long as the Khoja brothers are alive, the rebellion has a pulse.
So instead of sending an army into the mountains, which, I mean, is a logistical nightmare for any military...
Yeah, terrible terrain for an army.
Qianlong uses diplomacy. Or, well, more accurately, he uses weaponized bribery.
That's exactly what it was. The document details how Qianlong sends emissaries to the local ruler of Badakhshan. He offers staggering amounts of wealth, combined with the implicit threat of total annihilation if the ruler doesn't comply.
The geopolitical pressure on this local ruler is just immense.
It is. And the ruler of Badakhshan caves. He completely betrays the refugees. He orders the execution of Khoja Jahan and his brother.
Oh, wow. So her husband, the military tactician she fought alongside, the father of her child, is murdered. She's a widow, stranded in the mountains. Her army is completely shattered. And the most powerful empire in the world is actively hunting her.
From a purely pragmatic standpoint, the story should really end here.
It seems like it has to.
Right. The logical move for a surviving widow of a crushed rebellion is to disappear. You change your name, you fold into the nomadic populations of the Central Asian steppes, and you simply try to survive.
But she doesn't do that. And this is the moment in the source material where I really had to stop and reread, because her decision just defies basic self-preservation.
It really does.
She gathers the surviving remnants of her husband's army, which the text numbers at exactly 400 soldiers, 400 exhausted, traumatized fighters, and she decides to launch an offensive.
Yeah, she spends months surviving in the harsh conditions of the steppe, somehow reorganizing this tiny force. And then in 1762, she leads them across the Pamir Mountains to attack the Kashgar border.
Wait, I have to jump in here. 400 soldiers against the fortified border of the Qing Empire. Was this actually a tactical military maneuver? Or was this essentially a suicide mission? Why would 400 men follow a widowed queen into certain death?
It's a great question, and the author provides a really profound psychological and theological analysis of this exact moment. Because you're right, this wasn't about capturing territory.
Yeah, it couldn't be.
No, it was about narrative redemption. Remember her great-grandfather, Apak Khoja, the man who sold out the Khanate and invited the Dzungars in?
Right, the stain on the family lineage.
Precisely. The text argues that Nur Elanor made a conscious, highly ideologically driven decision to be the absolute antithesis of her ancestor. Where he compromised his homeland for power, she chose to sacrifice her life for her homeland's honor.
Wow.
She refused to betray her faith, and she refused to compromise her conscience by running. By leading those 400 men into an unwinnable battle, she was actively cleansing the historical ledger of her bloodline.
It is a staggering display of Central Asian honor codes colliding with imperial reality. She's literally choosing martyrdom over obscurity.
Yes, so she attacks.
Yeah.
But as expected, the sheer numerical superiority of the Qing forces pushes them back. They push them back to a place called Aksu, and the text describes the Battle of Aksu with almost cinematic detail.
It's a remarkable moment in the historical account. The Qing commander, a man named Zhao Hui, is actively managing the battlefield, and amidst all the chaos, he isolates a specific enemy commander on horseback who is fighting with terrifying skill, just cutting through his ranks.
Right, and Zhao assumes this is some hardened elite warlord. He orders his troops to swarm this single rider. They finally manage to surround the horse, and in the clash, the rider's helmet gets knocked off.
And when the helmet falls, the mechanics of the battle literally grind to a halt.
It's just a shocking moment.
The Qing soldiers expect a scarred veteran, but instead, 2 long braids of hair fall down. They are staring at a stunningly beautiful young woman in full armor.
And the text indicates that the psychological shock of this reveal, the sudden realization of who was actually slaughtering them, causes enough hesitation in the Qing lines that Nur Elanor manages to break the encirclement.
She uses their own shock against them and escapes toward a place called Kumbash.
She does, but the reality of numbers catches up. A single cavalry rider can't outrun an empire forever. She's eventually tracked down and captured alive.
Which initiates the next profound phase of this historical document. The warrior who sought to die on the battlefield is denied her martyrdom.
She is shackled and transported thousands of miles east, away from the steppes, away from everything she knows, into the suffocating, highly ritualized epicenter of Qing power, the Forbidden City in Beijing.
The culture shock alone must have been absolutely paralyzing. She is brought in not as a prisoner of war to be executed, but as a gift to Emperor Qianlong.
Yeah, a human gift.
She is thrust into a world where every gesture, every look, is governed by absolute protocol.
And the source material dives deep into the immediate clash of wills that occurs the moment she is brought before the emperor.
Right. In the Qing court, physical submission is non-negotiable. The protocol demands a Sengijuku, the 3 kneels and 9 bows. It's a full-body prostration that physically acknowledges the emperor as the absolute divine authority on earth.
But the text states that Nur Elanor simply stands there, in the middle of the throne room, surrounded by guards and courtiers who spend their entire lives bowing. She remains entirely upright.
The nerve that must have taken.
Oh, incredible nerve. She tells Emperor Qianlong directly that he is not God, and that as a Muslim, she only bows to Allah.
From a procedural standpoint, that is treason. Refusing the kowtow in front of the court isn't just an insult. It undermines the very foundation of imperial authority. The emperor could have ordered her dragged into the courtyard and executed in seconds.
Easily.
So why didn't he? I mean, why didn't an absolute monarch just use absolute force?
The author of the document explores Qianlong's psychological profile to explain this, and it's fascinating. Emperor Qianlong was deeply, deeply concerned with his historical legacy. He viewed himself not just as a conqueror, but as the benevolent father of the nation.
Ah, okay. A sophisticated, magnanimous ruler who brought diverse peoples under his enlightened umbrella.
Exactly. So executing a captive who refuses to break ruins that image entirely. If he uses brute physical force to torture or kill a woman who is so fiercely, eloquently defending her faith and her honor, he looks weak.
Right. He reduces himself from a divine ruler to a common thug.
Yes. It proves that he lacks the majesty to conquer her mind, leaving him only the power to destroy her body. He is completely captivated by her pride, because it is the one thing in his empire he seemingly cannot control.
So instead of the sword, he tries to use architecture and environment to break her. He embarks on this bizarre, obsessive campaign of assimilation through indulgence.
He attempts to build a gilded cage that mimics her homeland, hoping to soften her resolve through nostalgia. He constructs a Uyghur-style pavilion entirely for her.
But he goes much further than architecture. He actually imports 108 Uyghur families all the way from Kashgar, moving them to Beijing to form a neighborhood, just so she can hear her native language spoken and see her own culture represented outside her window.
The logistics of relocating 108 families across the continent just to manipulate the psychology of one captive is a terrifying display of absolute power.
It really is. The text also notes he built a mosque in the Yunminggun, the old summer palace, which actually stood until 1911.
He even manipulated the flora. The source details how he imported jujube trees, specifically known as jugge trees. He had them planted because he learned that she missed the trees from her home, with iron trunks, silver leaves, and golden fruit.
He is literally trying to terraform the Forbidden City to conquer her heart. But the text reveals that beneath the surface of these grand gestures, the reality of her captivity was incredibly tense and dangerous.
She didn't soften at all.
Not a bit. The document states she constantly hid a blade within her clothing. She lived in a state of perpetual hypervigilance, actively refusing the emperor's advances, fully prepared to defend her honor with lethal force if he crossed the line.
It is a complete stalemate. The emperor won't force her because of his ego, and she won't yield because of her faith. But the Forbidden City is a complex ecosystem, and there is another apex predator watching this dynamic unfold with growing alarm.
The Empress Dowager, Qianlong's mother.
Yes. The Empress Dowager is observing this obsessive standoff, and her calculus is purely geopolitical. She looks at this armed, defiant, deeply religious captive, and she sees a profound threat to the stability of the Qing dynasty.
And the text mentions she cites a specific historical precedent to justify her fear. She brings up Emperor Yongsheng, a previous ruler who, according to court rumors at least, was assassinated in his bedchamber by a vengeful concubine.
Right. She is genuinely terrified that Nur Elanor is going to pull that hidden blade and end Qianlong's life.
But the author suggests her fears ran even deeper than just assassination. What happens if the emperor's bizarre infatuation actually results in a child?
That's the real nightmare for her. What are the political ramifications of a Muslim heir to the Manchu throne, born of a woman who led a rebellion against the empire? The potential for civil war or a massive shift in dynastic power was just too great a risk.
So, while the emperor views her as a challenge to his legacy, the Empress Dowager views her as a tumor that needs to be excised. And she takes action. The source document states that in 1765, while Emperor Qianlong is away from the palace performing state duties, the Empress Dowager orchestrates Nur Elanor's death by poisoning her.
Her life in the imperial palace lasted only 3 intensely isolated years. She died at the age of 29.
29, just a tragic end. But to give us a window into what she was actually feeling during those 3 years of gilded captivity, the author introduces a vital piece of evidence, a poem.
This poem, which the author notes was provided by the historian Nazimuddin Hussain, is presented as her authentic voice. It is a striking piece of literature. It isn't a lament about lost luxury. It is a raw, defiant declaration of resistance.
In it, she articulates a clear readiness to die rather than abandon her faith or the memory of her homeland.
And the author uses this poem to contextualize her within a broader cultural framework. They compare her defiance to other legendary Uyghur heroines to show that her mindset wasn't an anomaly.
Right. They specifically reference a figure named Nazugum from roughly a century later, around 1862. Nazugum was a woman forced into a marriage with a Manchu official. Instead of submitting, she killed the official, fled into the harsh wilderness, and continued to write poetry of resistance while on the run before she was finally captured and executed.
The text also brings up the horrific event of the 7 girls of Ukturpan in 1765. During a local rebellion, these 7 women found themselves surrounded. Rather than surrender to the opposing forces, they collectively chose to jump off a cliff.
By linking Nur Elanor to Nazugum and the women of Ukturpan, the author is illustrating a deep-seated cultural ideology where honor and resistance supersede survival.
But the author makes a very specific theological point regarding Nur Elanor's situation in the palace. Suicide is strictly forbidden in Islam.
Ah, right. That is a crucial mechanism to understand. She couldn't just end her own life to escape the psychological torture of the emperor or the court.
Exactly. She was trapped by her theology as much as by the palace walls. She had to maintain her defiance, stand her ground, and basically force the empire's hand, fully preparing herself to accept death when it came from her enemies. She engineered her own martyrdom by refusing to yield.
And she achieved it. But this is where the narrative warfare truly begins. Because the Qing court couldn't conquer her in life, they decided to conquer her in the historical ledger. And this brings us to the systematic evolution of her legend.
Right. If you search the official state-sanctioned Qing records for the names Mamure Aziz or Nur Elanor, you will find absolutely nothing.
Just completely gone.
Expunged. The imperial historians essentially scrubbed her political reality from existence.
But, history abhors a vacuum. You cannot simply erase a woman who commanded armies and defied an emperor without leaving an imprint. The truth survives, but it survives in a mutated form. And the document pinpoints a major moment of rediscovery in the year 1914.
Yes, in 1914, there was an exhibition in the Gugong, the Forbidden City. Among the artifacts displayed was a portrait painted by an Italian artist who worked in the Qing court, known as Lian. The painting depicts a woman dressed in full knight's armor.
And it's the caption on this painting that reignites the historical debate. The caption reads, "Princess of the Western Regions, King Xiang Fei."
Xiang Fei. This is the birth of the third name in our historical puzzle. Xiang Fei translates to the Fragrant Concubine. Shortly after, in 1918, a poet named Shi Yin adds a poem to the display of this painting, explicitly detailing the subject's deep hatred for the emperor and her tragic longing for her homeland.
But I want to zero in on that name, Xiang Fei, because it is perhaps the most insidious part of this entire story. The myth that propagated through Chinese culture claimed that her body naturally emitted a powerful, intoxicating floral scent, that she was this magical, inherently fragrant creature.
And the author of the document aggressively dismantles this myth. They point out the biological absurdity of the human beings do not naturally secrete the scent of a botanical garden.
No, obviously not. So where did the myth come from? The text provides two very grounded logical explanations for why the court associated her with an overwhelming fragrance.
The first is cultural practice. Noble women from the Silk Road region heavily utilized traditional cosmetics, particularly highly concentrated rosewater and musk. To a king court entirely unfamiliar with these specific botanical extracts, the scent would have been incredibly distinct and foreign.
Makes total sense. And the second reason points back to Emperor Qianlong's obsessive architectural project. Remember the jigde trees.
The jujube trees, yes. The author notes that when these specific trees are in bloom, they emit a massive, powerfully sweet fragrance that literally blankets the area. It is entirely logical that the scent of the trees the emperor planted specifically for her became conflated with her physical person in the rumor mill of the court.
If we think about this conceptually, the renaming of Nur Elanor to Xiang Fei is a masterpiece of imperial PR spin. Think about modern algorithmic suppression or a targeted rebranding campaign.
It's a really good modern analogy.
The king court took a fiercely religious military commander who pulled an ice on the emperor, and they rebranded her as an exotic, sweet-smelling lifestyle aesthetic. They neutralized her political threat by turning her into a romantic fairy tale.
They stripped her of her armor, metaphorically speaking, and wrapped her in silk and flowers. It is an erasure of her agency. But the irony of narrative warfare is that once a myth is created, it can be hijacked by anyone. And the document shows how her image was constantly re-weaponized by subsequent political movements.
Yes, jump forward to the early 20th century. The Qing dynasty is crumbling. Sun Yat-sen and the nationalist movement need symbols to rally the populace against Manchu rule. They take the story of Xiang Fei, the captive who hated the emperor, and frame her as an anti-Manchu revolutionary icon.
Then the political landscape shifts again. After the establishment of the People's Republic in 1949, Chinese dramatists and writers begin interpreting her story through a new ideological lens. They write a series of highly popular plays, most notably one titled Iparhan's Wrath. In these adaptations, she is cast as a working-class hero valiantly fighting against the ethnic oppression of the feudal elite.
And it is actually the intersection of these 1950s plays and Uyghur academia that produces the final name we know her by today.
The document details a specific event in 1951. 3 prominent Uyghur scholars, Ibrahim Muti, Tokti Baki, and Jian Bozan, attend a performance of this play in Beijing. They watch the character of Xiang Fei, and they realize they need a culturally accurate way to translate this specific theatrical concept back to their own Uyghur audiences.
So they essentially brainstorm a localization. They coin the name Iparhan. They combine Ipar, a word relating to musk or deep fragrance, with Han, a title for a noblewoman.
It is a stunning historical irony. The name she is most globally recognized by today, Iparhan, was never spoken during her lifetime. It was invented nearly 2 centuries after she was poisoned, specifically to translate a Qing dynasty propaganda myth back into her native language.
It's mind-blowing. But before we move on to the physical evidence of her life, I want to clarify a very dense historical tangle that the source addresses. If you read various historical accounts, you will often see Chinese historians conflating Iparhan with another figure named Rongfei.
Yes, that happens a lot. Rongfei was an actual documented Muslim concubine who lived in the Qing court during Qianlong's reign. Because the timeline overlaps, a significant faction of historians argues that Xiang Fei and Rongfei are simply 2 different names for the exact same woman.
But the author of our document pushes back against this conflation with rigorous detail. They cite the work of an Uyghur researcher named Abdurrahim Sabit. Sabit dug into the unofficial histories and local records and discovered references to 5 completely different women who held the title of Rongfei.
Furthermore, the author points back to the primary visual evidence, the 1914 Italian painting. The caption clearly designates her as a princess of the Western region's king. It does not use the title of concubine.
Right.
The author posits that this is absolute proof she never officially accepted or was formally granted the status of a king concubine.
And there is one more layer of confusion the text clears up involving the name Dilshad Khatun. There was a Turkish play that popularized this name, and local legends occasionally claim that Dilshad Khatun was the one who rebuilt the famous tomb in Kashgar.
The document strictly categorizes this as an anachronism. Dilshad Khatun was actually a Manchu woman named Su Dixang, and the records show she rebuilt the Kashgar tomb in 1811. That is decades after Emperor Qianlong and Nur Elanor were dead. Merging Su Dixang into the Iparhan myth is a perfect example of how historical memory compresses and distorts over time.
It is a giant, centuries-long game of historical telephone, and this desperate fight over her identity, over what she represents and who she belonged to, seamlessly bleeds into the literal physical fight over her remains. Where is the body?
That is the ultimate question of the source material. The battle for her legacy isn't just fought in plays and academic papers, it is fought in the dirt. There are two fiercely competing claims regarding her final resting place, separated by over 3,000 miles.
Okay, let's examine the Kashgar claim first. Back in her homeland, at the Apak Khoja tomb, which is deeply ironic considering he's the ancestor who started the dynasty's collapse, there is a sprawling complex containing 72 graves. And one specific grave is set apart, masked off, and recognized by the local population as Iparhan's tomb.
The local oral history surrounding this grave is incredibly vivid and persistent. The narrative states that after she was murdered in the Forbidden City, the Uyghur community living in Beijing secretly embalmed her body. They then placed her on a palanquin, an enclosed, carried litter, and embarked on an agonizing 5,000-mile journey on foot to return her to her native soil.
The logistics of that journey are almost mythic in themselves. Sneaking an embalmed body out of the imperial capital and carrying it across deserts and mountains for months. And the text provides modern investigative details to support this local beliefs. It mentions that a researcher named Erpen Toktiov in 1956 and a separate expedition led by Yusubek Mukhlisov in 1957 visited the Kashgar site.
Both the researcher and the expedition team reported being shown a physical palanquin resting directly on top of the grave. The local custodians claimed this was the exact carriage utilized for that grueling 5,000-mile transport.
So the Kashgar narrative is one of triumphant, tragic repatriation. A warrior returned to the land she fought for. But then we have the Qing tombs claim, which relies on state-sponsored archaeology.
Fast forward to 1979, archaeologists are conducting excavations at the Qing Eastern Tombs, a massive imperial burial complex located near Beijing. During this dig, they uncovered the tomb of Xiang Fei. This tomb is subsequently opened to the public in 1983.
And the artifacts they find inside are highly suggestive. They find a coffin bearing Arabic inscriptions, specifically Bismillah, which translates to "in the name of God." They discover braided hair and texts written in minority languages.
Based on these artifacts, a Chinese historian named Lu Ming publicly declared that the debate was over. He claimed these findings definitively proved that Xiang Fei and Iparhan were, without a doubt, the exact same person, and that she lived out her days and was buried in the imperial complex in Beijing.
The state even went a step further to solidify this narrative. They extracted the skull from this tomb, and in 2007, forensic scientists performed a 3D facial reconstruction to show the world what the Fragrant Concubine supposedly looked like.
But the author of our source document launches a massive forensic pushback against this entire Beijing narrative. They raise glaring, highly logical doubts about the methodology and the conclusions of this archaeological claim.
First, they ask a question of simple logic. If she was this incredibly famous, beloved, culturally significant figure within the imperial court, why was her grave effectively lost until the late 1970s? Imperial tombs are meticulously cataloged.
The author then directs their critique at the 2007 facial reconstruction. This is where science intersects uncomfortably with statecraft. The author argues that the face generated by the forensic team looks distinctly ethnically Han, Hui, or Manchu. It bears zero physiological resemblance to the 1914 Italian painting of the Central Asian princess, and it does not align with the facial morphology of modern Uyghurs.
It is a stunning accusation. The suggestion that the forensic reconstruction was perhaps subconsciously or consciously guided to produce a face that aligned with the state's preferred narrative of assimilation, rather than historical ethnic reality.
Furthermore, the author points to the minority writings discovered in the tomb. They ask a very sharp, damning question. If texts were found alongside the coffin in 1979, why haven't they been fully translated, peer-reviewed, and published? We possess the linguistic capability to read those historical languages today. The author suggests the silence surrounding these texts is deeply suspicious.
But the author doesn't just rely on skepticism. They bring in corroborating evidence from within the Chinese academic establishment itself. They cite two specific Chinese researchers, Wang Woguang and Zhou Goshen, who also vigorously dispute the Xiang Fei is Iparhan theory.
The primary argument of these researchers is biological timeline incompatibility. The meticulous court records state that the concubine Xiang Fei lived to be over 50 years old and died in the year 1788.
But the historical timeline of Nur Elanor is radically different. She was captured at age 27 and was poisoned roughly 3 years later, dying around 1765 at the age of 29.
You cannot reconcile a 23-year discrepancy in death dates. To add physical weight to this timeline issue, the researcher Zhou Goshen specifically examined the skull extracted from the Beijing tomb. His forensic conclusion was that the skull belonged to a woman in her 50s, perfectly matching the records for Xiang Fei, but entirely disqualifying it as the skull of the 29-year-old captive.
And there's one final theological nail in the coffin of the Beijing claim. Zhou Goshen noted that the artifacts and positioning within the tomb strongly indicated the individual was buried according to Buddhist rites, not Islamic ones.
Therefore, the author concludes the body lying in the Qing Eastern tombs is absolutely not the warrior queen who led 400 men across the Pamir Mountains.
If you were listening to this, you might be asking, why does this granular debate over bones and carbon dating and facial reconstructions matter so much today? Why is the source so passionate about disproving the Beijing tomb?
It matters because archaeology in this context is not just the study of the past, it is the justification of the present. Whoever claims the body claims the right to define her historical meaning.
The author points out a deeply disturbing cultural trend. Back in the 1950s, regardless of whether you were a Chinese playwright or an Uyghur scholar, the core of her story was universally agreed upon. She was a symbol of fierce, unyielding resistance. She was a captive who fought her captors to the bitter end.
But the author notes how that narrative has been systematically inverted in recent years. They specifically mention a 2007 musical adaptation written by Min Shailan. In this modern iteration, Iparhan is no longer a rebel with a blade hidden in her sleeve. The narrative has been sanitized. She is portrayed instead as a cooperative figure who actively promoted ethnic harmony, assimilation, and unity between the Qing Empire and her people.
The author profoundly laments this ideological rewriting of history. By insisting that her tomb is located within the imperial graveyard, the modern state essentially claims her loyalty posthumously. They take a woman who chose to be poisoned rather than submit, and they transform her into a willing collaborator.
The author observes a brutal historical truth. The genuine, unvarnished history of captives, their defiance, their psychological suffering, their resistance, is rarely, if ever, allowed to survive in official imperial records. The ledger is always, inevitably, written by the victor.
And then that leads directly to the powerful, concluding sentiment of the source document. The author states that regardless of the academic debates, regardless of where the physical calcium of her bones actually rests, her true tomb is the soil of the homeland that created her, and the hearts of the people who refuse to forget her original spirit of defiance.
It is a total rejection of the imperial ledger. It is a declaration that memory maintained by the people outlasts the monuments built by the state.
We have covered an immense amount of historical and psychological ground today. Let's take a moment to synthesize what we've unpacked from this document. We began with Mamure Aziz, a young girl born into the crushing weight of exile, bearing the stigma of her family's past treason.
We followed her transformation into Nur Elanor, a brilliant tactician and warrior queen who led a desperate, almost suicidal charge against an overwhelming empire to redeem her bloodline's honor.
We examined the terrifying psychological warfare of her captivity in the Forbidden City, where she engaged in a battle of wills with Emperor Qianlong, ultimately choosing death over submission.
And then we witnessed the insidious machinery of narrative warfare. We saw how the empire attempted to erase her defiance by rebranding her as Xiang Fei, the Fragrant Concubine, reducing a military threat to a sweet-smelling exotic myth.
A myth that was eventually translated by scholars into the name Iparhan, creating a figure whose very bones, whether in Kashgar or Beijing, are still actively being fought over today to control the political narrative of an entire region.
It truly is a masterclass in the absolute malleability of history. It proves that the past is never settled. It is continuously shaped by whoever holds the pen, whoever funds the archaeological dig, and whoever writes the placard outside the tomb.
It is the ultimate proof that history is not a static ledger sitting in a dusty archive. It is an active, aggressive, ongoing argument.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder, a concept that builds directly on the themes of this document, but applies intimately to the world you are living in today. Consider the mechanics of imperial record-keeping that we discussed. The Qing dynasty attempted to erase this woman's rebellion through omission. They simply left her out of the official logs, they changed her name, they controlled the flow of paper, they relied on scarcity of information to build their myth.
Right, they curated the void.
Exactly. But in today's hyper-connected digital age, we exist in the exact opposite environment. We leave a massive, permanent, unimaginably detailed digital footprint every single second of our lives. Every text, every geographic ping, every algorithmic preference is recorded. So I want you to ask yourself this. If a future power or a future state apparatus wanted to rewrite your history 200 years from now, would that endless mountain of digital data make it impossible to erase who you truly were? Or would the sheer, overwhelming, chaotic volume of information make it easier than ever for them to cherry-pick data points, manipulate the narrative context, and invent a completely new, algorithmically generated version of your life? Is a flood of information harder to control than a single piece of paper, or does it just provide the myth makers with an infinite supply of raw material to sculpt whatever truth they desire?
That is a deeply unsettling question to sit with. Are we securing the truth of our existence? Or are we just giving the future more clay to mold into whatever shape they need? We want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the ledgers, keep searching for the omissions, and always, always question the narratives you are handed.
Until next time.
So today, we are analyzing an impassioned historical essay that seeks to untangle the real-life, multiple identities, and ultimate fate of Iparhan, the Uyghur heroine famously known as the Fragrant Concubine.
Yeah, it's a deeply fascinating piece.
It really is. And, right away, the author's deep expertise is completely evident. But our goal today is to elevate this robust historical case to make it completely bulletproof against academic skepticism.
Right, exactly. Because there are some vulnerabilities we need to address.
So jumping right in, let's start with the first area of feedback, which is all about source vulnerability and methodological framing.
A rigorous historical analysis must anticipate and preemptively address the skepticism surrounding undocumented primary sources.
Yeah. And in this case, we are talking about that two-stanza poem, right? The one provided by Nuzamuddin Hussein?
Exactly. The weakness here is that the essay anchors a crucial pillar of its argument regarding Iparhan's internal emotional state and her unwavering resistance on a poem for which no original manuscript exists.
Right.
Relying so heavily on an unverified, orally transmitted source without acknowledging the methodological vulnerability allows academic critics to easily dismiss the robust, fact-based historical case built in the rest of the text.
Which is dangerous because, the author openly acknowledges that the original manuscript is lost. So it feels a bit like building a heavily fortified castle on an unmapped fault line.
That is a perfect analogy, yes.
Like when a skeptical academic reads a historical text, they are actively looking for the load-bearing walls of the argument.
Mm-hmm.
And if they see that a major emotional conclusion is resting entirely on a lost manuscript, and the author proceeds as if that source is just empirical, hard data, the reader's trust kind of fractures.
Right. They assume the author is either unaware of the methodological gap or, worse, actively hiding it.
Exactly. So how do we fix that?
Well, my suggestion is to fortify the argument by explicitly discussing the historiographical challenges of lost sources.
Okay.
The author should frame the poem not as undeniable empirical proof, but as a vital piece of cultural memory that perfectly aligns with her documented historical actions.
I like that phrase, cultural memory. So what are some concrete examples of how the author could actually do this on the page?
So, when introducing the poem, the author could add a paragraph exploring why such manuscripts frequently disappear or are destroyed in colonized contexts.
Right, really leaning into it.
Yeah, effectively turning the lack of a physical manuscript into a supporting point about historical erasure.
Okay, but I want to push back on that specific intervention for a second.
Sure.
Doesn't dedicating a whole paragraph to the mechanics of archival preservation risk pulling the reader's focus away from Iparhan herself? Like, we'd be pausing the biography to give a lecture on, library science.
I see what you mean, but it doesn't distract from her narrative if it's framed as a continuation of the violence enacted against her.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, the missing physical ink becomes evidence of the Qing Empire's attempt to erase her agency. But if the author wants a different approach, they could juxtapose the poem's sentiment directly with a verified Qing record.
Oh, right. Like the moment she refused to kneel before Emperor Xianlong.
Exactly.
The source text mentions she stated that Muslims only bowed to the creator of the two worlds, just a complete refusal.
And that is the perfect empirical anchor. If the author places that highly documented, verified act of defiance directly alongside the poem's lines about swallowing blood and preparing for death,
then the poem stops needing to stand entirely on its own.
exactly. You demonstrate that even if the physical ink is lost, the poem's narrative is empirically backed by her actions. These are just a few ways out of many to transform a potential methodological gap into a compelling strength.
Beam, which is the official Qing court record.
Right. It shifts the author from hoping the reader won't notice the gap to confidently explaining the nature of the gap.
That makes total sense. And, speaking of structural bracing, that actually builds a great thematic connection to our second critique. Because if we are clarifying the reliability of the sources, we also really need to look at how the data from those sources is organized.
Yes, the structure of her identity.
Right. The manuscript details her 4 and potentially 5 names. There's Mamure Aziz, Nur Elanor, Xiang Fei, Rong Fei, and Dilshat Khatun.
It is a lot of names for a reader to track.
It is. And currently, the manuscript jumps back and forth between her lived chronology and her posthumous myth-making. It feels like watching 2 parallel timelines just colliding with each other.
Tracing a historical figure through multiple changing identities requires a highly disciplined chronological or thematic scaffolding to prevent reader disorientation.
Yeah, disorientation is the right word.
The weakness here is that the manuscript jumps abruptly between discussing her birth name, her political title, and the later Qing designations.
Right.
It mixes the timeline of her physical lived experience with the timeline of her posthumous political weaponization. This structural friction forces the reader to work way too hard to follow the exact progression of her identity erasure.
It totally dilutes the impact of the argument. Because, mentally, when a reader encounters a new name in a text, they kind of open a new file folder for that character.
Exactly.
So, if the text assigns Nur Elanor to a military campaign in Kashgar, and then in the very next paragraph assigns Xiang Fei to a theatrical play written in the 1950s...
the reader's mental file just corrupts.
Yes, they lose track of the actual human being buried under all that nomenclature. So, what is the suggestion to fix this flow?
The suggestion is to reorganize the section detailing her names, to strictly separate the identity she held in life from the names imposed upon her by others.
Okay.
Using these name changes as clear structural milestones that map directly onto her loss of agency.
I love that. Using the names as milestones. What are some concrete examples of how the author could structure that?
So the author could create distinct, clearly labeled subsections. One could be titled The Lived Names.
Okay.
And that would cover Mamure and Nur Elanor, detailing her active resistance and her life in the Ili and Kashgar regions.
Right, the names she actually answered to.
Exactly. And this would be followed by a section called The Captive Names, covering Rong Fei and Xiang Fei, detailing the Qing court's attempt to assimilate her image.
Let me play devil's advocate again, though.
Go for it.
History is rarely that clean, right? The posthumous myth of the Fragrant Concubine and the reality of the historical woman are constantly bleeding into each other in the cultural consciousness. Doesn't forcing a hard structural division artificially sanitize that messy reality?
It's a valid concern, but the goal of the structural division isn't to sanitize the history. It is to clarify the power dynamics for the reader.
Ah, power dynamics. Tell me more about that.
Well, Mamure Aziz was the name given by her family. Nur Elanor was the title she held alongside her husband while actively fighting the empire. Those names possess her active agency.
Right.
Rong Fei and Xiang Fei were designations thrust upon her while she was trapped behind the walls of the Forbidden City.
Ah, I see. So it acts as a shift in the narrative camera angle.
Precisely. In the lived names section, the reader experiences the history from a first-person perspective, moving through the world with her.
And the moment the reader crosses the structural dividing line into the captive names section, the camera angle violently shifts to a third-person surveillance feed operated by the Qin court.
Yes, the reader actually feels the trap closing. It takes the burden of chronological sorting completely off the reader's shoulders.
That is so powerful, because the transition from Nur Elanor, which translates to, a revered queen bathed in light?
Yes.
Transitioning from that to Xiang Fei, a romanticized concubine whose body supposedly emitted a floral scent, becomes a really visible descent into historical manipulation.
And another option, just as a concrete structural tweak, is to use a specific year as a hard dividing line.
Like what year?
Like 1914. That was when the Italian artist's portrait of Xiang Fei was exhibited.
Oh, wow, yes.
Teen exhibition is such a cinematic pivot point. I mean, you have a portrait of a woman in European-style armor, labeled as the Princess of the Western Regions, displayed at an antiquities exhibition in Beijing long after the fall of the Qing Dynasty.
It's wild.
It really thrusts her from imperial captivity directly into 20th century political utility.
It demonstrates that the rewriting of her identity didn't stop when she died. Using 1914 as a structural barrier signals to the reader that we are no longer discussing the life of a woman, we are discussing the life of a state-sponsored ghost.
A state-sponsored ghost. That is a great way to put it. And that actually connects the structural milestones perfectly to our third and final critique, which is about the thematic framing, the so what of the essay.
Right, the overarching meaning.
Near the very end of the text, the author drops an absolutely brilliant observation. They write, 10 rulers write 10 histories.
Such a great line.
It is! And they point out that Iparhan's tomb and the modern facial reconstruction are modern extensions of this historical manipulation. But I have to push back on the placement of this. Leaving this profound insight until the very end is like writing a magnificent overture, but accidentally playing it as the finale.
An essay's most profound thematic insight should serve as the lens through which the entire narrative is viewed, rather than being relegated to a concluding thought.
Exactly. So what is the core weakness here?
The weakness is that the powerful observation that Iparhan's story is a prime example of history being constantly altered by those in power is buried near the end of the text.
Right.
Because this framework isn't established early on, the reader spends much of the essay viewing the piece purely as a narrow biographical correction, rather than a sweeping, urgent commentary on the continuous manipulation of historical memory.
Yes, it's all about the psychology of narrative framing. If you don't provide the reader with a thematic map until they have already exited the maze, they just spend the entire reading experience bumping into dead ends.
Exactly. They're just trying to figure out what all these disparate dates and names are supposed to mean in the grand scheme of things.
So what's the suggestion?
Move this concept of historiographical manipulation to the very beginning of the essay. Use it as the overarching thesis that guides the reader through all the subsequent evidence regarding her names, the lost poem, and the disputed tombs.
Okay, give me some concrete examples of how to execute that.
The author could open the entire essay with the 10 rulers, 10 histories concept, immediately priming the reader that Iparhan's life is a literal battleground for truth.
I love that.
Or, as another example, when discussing the 2007 facial reconstruction from the Xiang Fei tomb, the author could tie this directly back to that opening thesis.
Oh, that changes the whole context of the facial reconstruction.
Right. Because currently, when the reader encounters the section about archaeologists reconstructing her face, it just reads like a piece of modern scientific trivia.
Yeah, like an episode of a true crime show or something. But if you tie it back to the opening thesis...
Exactly. If you tie it back, the reader's perception completely transforms. They don't just see scientists analyzing a skull, they see modern archaeology participating in the exact same rewriting process as the Qing emperors.
Trying to force a Manchu appearance onto a Uyghur heroine to serve a contemporary political narrative.
Yes. Implementing one of these approaches will transform the essay from a simple historical dispute into a masterclass on the politics of memory.
It also dramatically reframes the debate over where she is actually buried, doesn't it?
Oh, completely.
Because the material outlines the tension between the grand Eastern Qing tombs in Beijing and the Apak Khoja mausoleum in Kashgar.
Right, and the historical records from Kashgar state she died at 29, entirely alone, whereas the skull in Beijing belonged to a woman over 50.
So if the reader has been primed with the 10 rulers concept, they instantly recognize the grand tomb in Beijing not as like a historical anomaly to be debated, but as an act of political theater.
A theater designed to assimilate her legacy into the imperial core.
Wow. It really elevates the local oral traditions in Kashgar, too. The material mentions the belief that her body was carried back to her homeland on a palanquin over 5,000 miles.
Right.
Whether that is physically true or a cultural myth, front-loading the thesis allows the reader to understand that this oral tradition is the Uyghur people actively fighting back against the 10th ruler.
It is an act of cultural reclamation, trying to pull her legacy out of the hands of the empire.
That is incredibly powerful, but let me raise a potential limitation here.
Okay.
Does leading with 10 rulers write 10 histories make the author sound too ideological too quickly? Like in academic writing, leading with a sweeping philosophical statement about state-sponsored manipulation can sometimes cause a skeptical reader to just put their guard up.
That is a crucial consideration. You don't want them to assume the piece will be heavy on rhetoric and light on data.
Right.
To mitigate that risk, the author must anchor the thematic statement immediately in hard structural data. They cannot just state the philosophy and linger there.
So how do they transition?
They should introduce the 10 rulers concept and in the very next paragraph present the hard data about her birth name versus her captive name, utilizing the structural division we discussed earlier.
Ah, okay. So the philosophy acts as the lens, but the immediate introduction of the rigorous name chronology proves to the reader that the lens is actually justified by empirical evidence.
Precisely. The ideology is instantly backed by objective methodology.
It turns the essay into a rigorous detective story, where the culprit isn't just a single emperor, but the very mechanism of state-sponsored history itself.
Exactly.
Well, this has been an incredibly deep dive. Let's pull all of these narrative threads together and recap the main takeaways from today's critique.
Sounds good.
First, we address the vulnerability of undocumented sources, specifically framing the lost manuscript of her poem within the context of historical erasure, rather than letting it sit as an unacknowledged gap.
Right. And second, we suggested structuring the evolution of her names into clear lived versus imposed milestones, using structural barriers like the 1914 portrait to clarify the timeline of her lost agency.
And finally, third, we talked about elevating the 10 rulers, 10 histories concept to the very beginning of the essay, using it as the guiding thesis so that the reader understands the overarching political stakes of the entire narrative right from the jump.
These structural and thematic shifts are really going to make the already deeply researched piece absolutely unassailable. The core facts don't change, but the way they are delivered becomes undeniable.
I couldn't agree more. We want to genuinely thank the author for sharing such a vital and rigorously researched piece of history with us.
Yes, thank you so much.
And we warmly invite you to implement these structural and thematic suggestions. And please, submit your revised work back in for another critique. We would love to see how it evolves, because ultimately, when we are dealing with a historical legacy that has been systematically distorted by competing empires, our own writing cannot afford to be fragile. We have to hand the reader the tools they need to uncover the incredible, enduring human truth underneath centuries of myth.
Welcome to the debate. Picture this. It's 1762, near Aksu in Central Asia. A really fierce, chaotic battle is raging.
And the Qing Dynasty army is just pressing this relentless attack, right?
Right, led by Commander Zhao Hui. But on the opposing side, there is this brilliant, frankly terrifying military tactician on horseback. And this warrior is fighting with such ferocity, striking down enemies with such precision that Zhao Hui actually sends a special detachment with one singular goal.
To take this rider down.
Exactly. So they surround the warrior, they strike, and the helmet is knocked clean off.
And what is revealed under that helmet completely paralyzes the Qing soldiers. I mean, the dust settles, the battlefield freezes, and they are staring at a beautiful woman with 2 long braids.
It's an incredible image. That woman is the Uyghur noblewoman Iparhan, born Mamure Aziz in 1734 in the Nilka region. And that cinematic, almost unbelievable moment of capture is where her story as a free woman ends.
But it's also where a massive centuries-long historical controversy begins. Because what actually happened to her after she was taken captive, dragged back to the Qing court in Beijing, is fiercely debated.
Yes, and today we are diving right into that very tension. I'll be arguing that all the cultural evidence, the oral traditions, and the ideological context point to a history of Iparhan as an uncompromising resistor, a woman who absolutely refused to submit to the Qianlong emperor and was ultimately murdered for her defiance.
And I look at that exact same history and see a totally different reality. I'll be arguing that while the narrative of her unyielding martyrdom is culturally resonant, the hard archival records and modern archaeological evidence tell us a story of survival. The physical evidence strongly suggests she was actually integrated into the Qing court as the Muslim concubine Xiang Fei.
To understand why the resistance narrative is really the most credible way to read her life, we have to look at who Iparhan was before that helmet came off. She was not just some passive aristocrat waiting in a palatial garden. She was a descendant of the powerful Apak Khoja lineage.
Which is a massive deal, culturally speaking.
Huge. Let me clarify what that means. Being part of the Apak Khoja lineage meant her family held both religious and political supremacy in the region. They were Sufi leaders. So when you are raised from birth believing your family's authority is divinely ordained, submission to a foreign emperor isn't just a bitter political defeat.
It's a spiritual impossibility.
Exactly. She was trained by her brothers in swordsmanship, archery, and equestrian combat.
She was essentially raised as a warrior monk, in a sense.
Right. She married the poet-warrior Khoja Jahan, and together they formed the Battle Khan government. She didn't just support him from the sidelines either. She literally fought alongside him under the title Nur Elanor Hanim.
Which translates to Queen Bathed in Light, right?
Yes, exactly. And when her husband was ultimately betrayed and beheaded in Badakhshan, she didn't surrender. She gathered 400 of his surviving soldiers and launched a desperate counteroffensive. That is the psychological profile of the woman who arrived in Beijing as a captive of war.
And the source material gives us a very vivid picture of that arrival, doesn't it?
It really does. Upon her presentation to the Qianlong emperor, she was ordered to kneel. You know, the standard imperial command to kneel 3 times and kowtow 9 times. She absolutely refused.
Just stood there?
Stood tall, in the center of the court and declared, "The Khan is not God. We Muslims only bow to Allah." The material notes she even carried a hidden dagger to protect her honor from the emperor. You simply cannot maintain that level of immense tension in the imperial court indefinitely.
No, something has to give.
Exactly. By 1765, when the emperor was away from the capital, the Empress Dowager took action. She had Iparhan poisoned. And if we look at the mechanics of imperial power, this makes perfect sense. The Empress Dowager feared an assassination attempt, sure, but more importantly, she feared a geopolitical nightmare.
A half Uyghur, half Manchu Muslim heir having a claim to the Qing throne.
Right. Poisoning her is the most logical, consistent conclusion to the life of a warrior who had lost everything but refused to lose her pride.
Wait, let me stop you there. Because I hear the power in that narrative. It's an incredible story of defiance. But as historians, we have to look at what the physical and archival evidence actually tells us, not just the stories that make for a good tragedy.
Sure, but the archives aren't everything.
No, but they are meticulous. If we rely on the official Qing court records, and we need to remember that these were obsessive daily logs, tracking everything from what the emperor ate to who he visited, there is absolutely no mention of an Iparhan, nor is there any mention of a Xiang Fei or Fragrant Concubine, which is the mythic name she was later given.
Which makes sense if she was a political prisoner.
Well, what the archives do document extensively is a Muslim concubine named Xiang Fei.
But assuming Xiang Fei is Iparhan is a pretty massive leap?
It's a leap supported by profound archaeological evidence, though. Let's look at the hard science. In 1979, researchers excavated Xiang Fei's grave in the Qing Eastern tombs. Inside, they found a coffin inscribed in gold.
With Arabic phrasing, right?
Yes, with the phrase Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim surrounded by traditional court artifacts. The physical remains were of a woman who lived past the age of 50, dying around 1788. This doesn't point to a dramatic martyrdom in her 20s.
You're saying it points to adaptation.
It points to a woman who survived in the court for decades. She lived a long, deeply complex, and integrated life within the imperial system.
Okay, but if the physical evidence suggests she survived as this perfectly integrated concubine, then we have to explain the ghost. Where did the legend of the Fragrant Concubine who died in fiery defiance actually come from, if not from a core historical truth?
I mean, how do we account for the immense cultural footprint of Xiang Fei?
Exactly.
We account for it by recognizing the mechanics of propaganda. The name Xiang Fei and the entire legend of her uncompromising resistance were largely fabricated long after she was dead. The source material notes that the name didn't even appear in writing until 1914.
1914, that's quite a gap.
Right. Think about the timeline there. It was written beneath an Italian painting by a Jesuit artist named Castiglione, who also went by Leon, depicting a proud woman in armor. The myth of Xiang Fei operates exactly like a political Rorschach's test.
Meaning people see what they want to see?
More than that, she became a blank space in the official archives, so every subsequent era could project their own political anxieties onto her. Let's unpack that. After the Qing dynasty collapsed in 1911, Sun Yat-sen's new republic desperately needed stories of anti-Manchu resistance to build national solidarity.
Ah, so they drafted her into the narrative.
Exactly. Iparhan's story was co-opted to fit that mold. She became a proto-nationalist hero. Decades later, after 1949, communist writers adapted her all over again, this time drafting her as a champion against imperialism and ethnic oppression, writing plays like The Wrath of Iparhan.
But what about the fragrance?
The idea that her body naturally emitted some magical floral fragrance? That is the hallmark of folklore. It's a biological absurdity invented to make her seem otherworldly. She was a canvas upon which different eras painted their own political ideologies.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. You are right that modern political movements used her image, but the fragrance myth doesn't invalidate her resistance. In fact, it actually stems from a historical truth of that resistance. Let's look closely at Emperor Qianlong's behavior.
Okay, what about his behavior?
He was absolutely desperate to win over this defiant captive. The source material details that he went to extraordinary, almost unprecedented lengths. He didn't just lock her in a standard court chamber. He built her a Uyghur-style palace. He constructed a mosque for her in the Yunmingyoren Gardens.
Which, suggests accommodation, not a standoff.
It suggests an emperor who is dealing with someone who refuses to adapt to his world, so he tries to build a piece of her world for her. He even relocated 108 Uyghur families all the way from Kashgar to Beijing to create a red skullcap Muslim neighborhood outside her window.
Just so she would feel less isolated.
Right. But here is the most telling detail. He had jigaha, Russian olive trees, brought thousands of kilometers from Kashgar and planted around her palace. The fragrance the legend speaks of wasn't some biological miracle. The fragrance wasn't biology. It was geography.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, the Qing court mistook the scent of the jigda blossoms, which are incredibly aromatic, for a mystical bodily trait. That scent was forever tied in the court's memory to a woman who refused to become a conventional concubine. Notice that the 1914 Italian painting you mentioned didn't label her as a concubine at all.
It labeled her as the princess of the Western region.
Exactly. Her unique status in the court, surrounded by the scent of her homeland, birthed the Xiang Fei name because she maintained her distinct identity. She never assimilated.
That is a very compelling framing. The fragrance as geography is a beautiful metaphor, but we still have to contend with the mechanism of how history is recorded.
Sure.
The court archives under any of her real names, Mamure Aziz or Nur Elanor.
Because the history of the conquered is rarely found in the archives of the conqueror. You brought up the mechanism of recording history, so let's look at the scribes. We are talking about a woman whose race, appearance, language, and religion were completely alien to the Qing court.
True, the linguistic barrier was high.
The linguistic barrier alone means her Uyghur name would have been difficult for Manchu and Han scribes to transliterate. But more importantly, altering a political prisoner's name is a deliberate act of erasure. It's a strategy. It distances the captive from their indigenous identity and the political threat they represent to the state.
But
You can't just throw out the archives.
We have to look outside the official imperial ledger. We have to examine the ideological context of 18th century Uyghur women. For a woman of her standing, submission was culturally impossible.
Impossible is a very strong word when we are talking about basic human survival in a hostile environment. People adapt to survive.
But refusing to adapt is entirely consistent with the behavior of her contemporaries. Look at the source material regarding the 1765 Uch Turpan uprising. When that rebellion was finally crushed by Qing forces, the 7 girls, including Maisie Khan and her companions, found themselves surrounded on a mountain peak.
And they jumped, right?
Yes. Rather than surrender to the Qing soldiers and face certain humiliation and captivity, they threw themselves into a deep gorge. Or consider Nazugum, a century later, who was forced to marry a Manchu official. She killed him in his bed before fleeing into the unforgiving wilderness.
It's a very intense resistance culture.
This is the precise ideological framework Iparhan operated within. This insistence on honor, on keeping one's faith pure, is perfectly captured in the poem attributed to her by the researcher Nizamuddin Hussain. The lines are explicit. "My choice is not to surrender my faith. I am ready to give my life before the Khan." She was deeply influenced by her Sufi upbringing and her poet-warrior husband. Her poetry is the true archive of her mind.
I come at it from a different way. I don't deny the tragic beauty of that poem, nor do I dismiss the incredible, frankly sobering bravery of the women in the Ukturpan uprising. But as an historian, I have to question the physical provenance of that poetry.
In what way?
The source material openly acknowledges that the original manuscript of this poem does not actually exist. It was passed down through a researcher's notebook. Relying on a transcribed poem and broad ideological assumptions over hard science is a dangerous game when trying to establish historical fact.
But history isn't just hard science.
No, but let's return to it for a moment. The researcher Zhou Goshin conducted a rigorous analysis of the skull recovered from the Qing tomb. The findings were meticulous. The woman in that tomb was over 50 years old. But here is the critical detail that disrupts the pure resistance narrative.
The burial rites?
Exactly. The artifacts and the arrangement of the grave indicated that the body was buried with Buddhist rites alongside the Arabic script on the coffin.
Which directly contradicts her strict Islamic faith. That proves it couldn't be her.
Or it suggests a complex, compromised integration. It suggests a woman who lived in the Qing court for decades, navigating a highly syncretic environment where her Islamic heritage and the imperial Buddhist practices of the court overlapped.
I just don't see someone with her background accepting that.
Think about the logistics of imperial death. The presence of the Arabic Bismillah confirms her Muslim identity and honors her roots. But the Buddhist rites confirm her integration into the imperial family structure. You don't get a hybrid burial like that if you are murdered in your 20s as a pure ideological martyr.
So you see it as proof of life, essentially.
A hybrid burial is the signature of a life lived in the gray area. You get it if you survive, adapt, and live out your life as Xiang Fei.
That's an interesting point, though I would definitely frame it differently. The fundamental assumption that the woman in that Beijing tomb is Iparhan is exactly what I am challenging. If you're listening to this and wondering why a single grave matters so much, it's because bodies are the ultimate historical receipts.
Whoever has the body claims the truth of how she lived.
Exactly. Just because Chinese archaeologists in 1979 found a Muslim concubine named Xiang Fei who lived to be 50 does not inherently mean Xiang Fei and Iparhan are the same person. In fact, researcher Abdurrahim Sabit found records of 5 different Muslim concubines residing in the Qing court during that era.
Okay, but the Beijing tomb?
The Beijing tomb discovery conveniently ignores the massive, enduring physical and geographical evidence pointing to a completely different resting place, Kashgar.
Ah, you're referring to the burial controversy, the legend that her body was returned to Xinjiang.
Yes, and it is far more than just a passing legend. The oral history is highly specific. It states that her fellow Uyghur captives in Beijing, the very 108 families Shenlong brought over to appease her, had her body secretly embalmed after she was poisoned by the Empress Dowager.
And then they transported it?
They then carried her body over 5,000 kilometers back to her homeland.
Wait, 5,000 kilometers?
Right, to be buried in the Apak Khoja tomb complex. Let's just pause on that distance. 5,000 kilometers is roughly the distance from New York to San Francisco.
It's a massive undertaking.
This was a monumental act of devotion. And this isn't just a story told around a fire. In 1956 and 1957, researchers Erpan Totiev and Yusufbek Mukhlisov conducted formal expeditions to the site in Kashgar. They were shown the actual Palanquin, the physical wooden carriage used to transport her body from Beijing.
And that's still there?
It rests directly above her grave. There are 72 graves in that complex, and hers is distinctively shrouded and maintained. The people who actually lived this history preserved the physical evidence of her return.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that timeline. Let me tell you why. The Kashgar burial narrative completely collapses when you cross-reference the dates and understand how oral history functions. The local legend claims that a Manchu woman named Sudek Xiang, who was known locally as Dilshat Hatun, brought Iparhan's body to Kashgar under the emperor's direct orders.
Yes.
But the source material clearly shows that the poem and the architectural records placing Sudek Xiang at that tomb date to the year 1811.
Which was after Qianlong's reign had ended.
Exactly. By 1811, Emperor Qianlong was dead and Emperor Qing was ruling. The idea that Qianlong ordered this massive 6-month funeral procession across 5,000 kilometers simply does not fit the chronological facts.
You think it's a conflation?
If the procession happened in 1811, it could not have been for a woman who was allegedly poisoned by the Empress Dowager in 1765. The math just doesn't work. Now, why do oral histories conflate timelines like this? Because oral history doesn't care about the Gregorian calendar. It cares about emotional truth.
I think that's a bit dismissive of indigenous memory.
It's not dismissive. It's just how human memory works over centuries. Local legends compress time, merging a historical funeral procession from 1811 with a cultural hero from 1765 to create a single unified story of homecoming. Furthermore, the 1979 Beijing tomb discovery contained not just the coffin, but gray braided hair, imperial court garments, and minority artifacts.
All of which could belong to Xiang Fei.
The researchers cross-referenced these physical items meticulously with the daily court logs of Xiang Fei. It is a definitive resting place. The Kashgar tomb is a cenotaph, an empty tomb acting as a memorial. It is an incredibly powerful emotional anchor for the Uyghur people, but it is not her actual grave.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because it places absolute faith in the continuity of imperial records, while completely dismissing the continuity of indigenous memory as mere conflation.
Right.
The specific dates surrounding Sudek Xiang might be messy. Oral history stretching across centuries often fold different figures and eras into one another.
Right.
But the core truth, the existence of the wooden palanquin, the meticulous care of the 72 graves, the absolute ideological consistency of her resistance, cannot be swept away by simply pointing to a different woman's grave in Beijing. To say Xiang Fei as Iparhan is a leap of imperial convenience.
Convenience?
Think about it. It is much easier for an empire's history to claim that the rebellious captive eventually settled down, learned her place, and lived quietly until 1788, than to admit she chose death over submission. The archives write the history they want to be true.
An oral history remembers the hero it needs to survive.
Perhaps. But to summarize my view on the evidence, the life of Iparhan is a testament to the fact that the true history of the conquered is rarely found neatly categorized in the archives of the conqueror. When we look at the poetry she left behind, the deeply ingrained oral histories of her embalming and 5,000-kilometer return to Kashgar, and the ideological consistency of Uyghur resistance in the 18th century, we see a clear, unindictable picture.
A picture of total resistance.
Yes. Iparhan was a defiant military tactician. She refused to kneel, refused to surrender her faith, and her true history was deliberately erased by Qing court scribes who simply could not process her unyielding nature.
And to summarize my perspective, while the resistance narrative is emotionally compelling and undeniably vital to cultural identity, we cannot ignore the physical earth. The archaeological discovery of Xiang Fei's tomb in Beijing, complete with Arabic inscriptions overlapping with Buddhist burial rites, points to a much longer, integrated life.
The gray area.
Exactly. When we combine that physical reality with the severe timeline discrepancies of the Kashgar legend,
specifically those 1811 Qing-era details. The most evidence-based conclusion is that Iparhan survived. She became Xiang, navigating the incredible, perilous complexities of the Qing court for decades.
Well, if there is a point of convergence between us today, it is this. Iparhan, whether she died young in absolute defiance or lived a long syncretic life as Xiang, remains an incredibly vital figure. Her physical body and her historical identity have been continuously overwritten by different political eras over the last 2 centuries.
It's really remarkable.
From the 1914 painting that branded her Xiang Fei, to the Republic's anti-Manchu hero, to the modern scientific debates over her skull and her poetry, she has never truly been allowed to rest.
I agree entirely. She serves as a fascinating lens through which we view the collision of empires, the messy translation of cultures, and the ways in which modern politics constantly reaches back to rewrite the past to serve the present.
For those listening who want to pull on these historical threads further, the source material offers fascinating nuances about the broader Apak Khoja lineage and the Kucha rebellion that we barely had time to touch on today. The geopolitical forces that shaped her world were really vast.
It really demands that we ask ourselves a profound question about how we view history. What do we value more, the perfectly preserved, clinically written court document, or the cultural memory carried on a wooden palanquin across a desert?
Precisely. Just like that battlefield at Aksu we started with. The sword strikes, the helmet is knocked away, and for a brief, stunning second, the truth is visible.
But then the dust of history rises again.
Yes, leaving us to piece together the beautiful, complicated reality of who was really underneath. Thank you for joining us.